Hi everyone, this is Mrs. Tevis-Finn recording from Franklin. This is the Progressive Era, Part 3. We're looking at the three presidents: Theodore Roosevelt, also known as Teddy; William Howard Taft, the largest president ever in the White House; and Woodrow Wilson. So let's get right into Theodore Roosevelt. Under your guided notes, I want you guys to fill in that Teddy believed that the federal government had a responsibility to use its power to protect the common people. So he had a powerful presidency, and he believed in an active executive branch. He was an avid outdoorsman, and this is a famous picture of him riding a moose. During his term, he called his programs a square deal. So it comes from a famous quote. He's known to have said, "A man who is good enough to shed his blood for his country is good enough to be given a square deal afterwards. More than that no man is entitled to, and less than that no man shall have." So let's talk about this quote in our groups, but I kind of want you guys to think about the Gilded Age, right, and all the wealth in the hands of the few. And so Teddy is really trying to shake things up and trying to, change that huge gap between the rich and the poor. All right, let's go back to the guided notes. So one way he, helps the common man is in the anthracite coal strike of 1902. So guys, please put down that he brokered or acted as a mediator. Right, he's really getting involved as president. So as a mediator for the workers here, they were demanding 20% raise, an 8-hour workday, and the right of union representation. So Teddy Roosevelt really flexed his muscles in this strike. He even threatened to send in federal troops, the U.S. Army, to run the mines if the mining owners didn't accept the negotiation. So Teddy scores a point here. So let's go down to the guided notes for trusts and monopolies. So yes, he believed, that the trusts and new corporations that came out of the Gilded Age were one of the reasons for America's prosperity. But he also saw how the monopoly's power of some trusts hurt the public interest. So he went after, pictured here, J.P. Morgan, who was really the king of the Northern Securities Trust, which was a railroad monopoly. And so he goes after bad trusts. He targets them because they hurt competition, in the industry. And here's another picture of Teddy, shown to be leading the way in controlling corporations and trust. And here he's using his jiu-jitsu, his looks like karate. So, Teddy was very competitive. I would say he scores another point here against J.P. Morgan. So he also targets food and safety. This was the time of the jungle. Remember, we read the excerpt in class. And so he passes the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. So the federal meat inspectors are finally placed in the slaughterhouses. All right, guys, and just take a look at the picture here. Here's the animal that was just slaughtered, and here they are treating them in some liquid. I can't imagine the smell. So I'd say score another point for Teddy. And the USDA comes out of this time. It did, was started by Lincoln, but really it's during Theodore Roosevelt's presidency that begins to focus on inspecting food. And so, guys, another thing I want you to know is the Pure Food and Drug Act. So you guys can fill in, it set standards for contaminants in food and medicine. So, milk pasteurization, right? Inspecting foods that were sold across state lines. So that's how the federal government was able to get involved. Really looking at sanitation. And so it really was a big part of the government, starting obviously during the Civil War time, but then by 1912 it has a huge budget of $24 million. And so here's some food for thought, no pun intended. Who is checking on what you guys eat? Have you heard of any recent recalls? Because these are all from just the month of November. So this is from the USDA website. You guys should just know that the USDA comes out of the Progressive Era as a very powerful federal institution. But, look at this. This is just in our country. Raw poultry is being recalled. It's not inspected. Look at this. Ready-to-eat salads with chicken could be contaminated with E. coli. I don't know if you guys know that, but that comes from fecal matter. And then here we have chicken sausages that aren't labeled because they have MSG. I don't know if you guys know, but MSG is a trigger for people with migraines and nervous system disorders. Before we move on, guys, I just gave you these pictures from the time period, to go along with the Pure Food and Drug Act, because this certainly shows how this was not regulated. So before the Progressive Era, there really was a need for reform. Look at this. Cocaine toothache drops. Instantaneous cure. I'm sure it made you feel fabulous, but then you would get addicted. Look at this. For sale by all druggists. And here's just some other kinds of tonics and things. Look, this says epilepsy and nerve disorder. So, this really shows that we needed the federal government to be involved in regulating this industry. And lastly, let's score another point for Teddy on that Pure Food and Drug Act, but let's also look at conservation. Remember, he was a huge outdoorsman. He was extremely competitive, and he really thought that our lands needed to be protected, so he increased our national parks. He was looking at the Progressive Era's scientific standards, right? Remember, we've talked about how cities were now more efficient and industry, so he wanted to use those to apply it to forestry and resource management. He didn't want to sell our land, right, to lumber companies. He added more than, you guys can fill in, 100 million acres to the national forest. And he also increased our wildlife reservations. So, here's a great quote from Teddy. "Here is your country. Cherish these natural wonders. Cherish the natural resources. Cherish the history and romance as a sacred heritage for your children and your children's children. Do not let selfish men or greedy interests skin your country of its beauty, its riches, or its romance." So, you guys know, but national parks started in the late 1800s, Yellowstone being the first in 1872, but Teddy is known for establishing two. This first one is called Mesa Verde in Colorado, and he also, this is a beautiful one, he's also established Crater Lake in Oregon. So I would score another few points for Teddy. Alright, let's go on to William Howard Taft. Shown here, he was over 300 pounds. He really continued the policies of Teddy. He didn't really do anything different. And because of his size and his personality, he was asked to, quote, sit on the lid of certain issues, right, when things were tough and his presence was needed. And so here's your fun fact. Here's a picture of Taft's bathtub before it was installed. It had to be able to fit 4 grown men. And the story is that in his previous bathtub, he had gotten stuck in it and had to be pried out. So, William Howard Taft. Let's keep going. So, he continues trust busting. He goes against U.S. Steel, the Sugar Trust, and you guys fill in Standard Oil, pictured here. I mean, look at this political cartoon showing how greedy the monopolies are. And so, Taft does go after them successfully. I would say another great legacy of Taft is that he really supported the end of child labor. He set up the Children's Bureau in the Department of Labor, 1912, and it still exists today. So very important. So it deals with issues of child abuse, adoption, and foster care. He also continued policies of conservation, but his big milestone was the 16th Amendment, which was the federal income tax. This was 1913. Think about today that tax rates are around 35%, but back then it was truly revolutionary to be able to raise this kind of revenue for the U.S. government. It pretty much started with rates of about 5%, but it was very radical for the time. And here's a political cartoon to kind of stir up some controversy. The big hippo of being the federal income tax, and then here it says rich man, poor man, beggar, thief, doctor, lawyer, merchant. They all are putting their money into the big mouth. So taxes certainly can stir up a lot of controversy among the American citizens. And last of the Progressive Era is Woodrow Wilson. His time was known as New Freedom. He was quite a unique president. Here he's pictured, he was the president of Princeton University, pretty prestigious college in New Jersey. You know, he also was a professor, so very, very academic. And pictured here with his second wife. So this is pretty controversial for the time. His first wife died, and actually within less than a year, he had married another woman. She was a widower. And the final controversy of Wilson's presidency was his declining health, and he'd had a series of strokes, and Edith kept it all secret and tried to run the presidency for him. So lots of scandals. Okay, so Wilson passes the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. So here's a good quote I found about the Fed, and bottom line is that its main responsibility is controlling interest rates. It oversees things like the banking system by manipulating the money supply. It is a central bank, so it does try to kind of create stability for our banking system. Wilson also passes the Clayton Antitrust Act in 1914, which here is another cartoon pictured here. It doesn't go after all the trusts, but he does further restrict the monopolies. And he does establish unions' right to exist, which is, coming on the side of supporting workers. And lastly, the Federal Trade Commission. So the Federal Trade Commission Act sets up this new federal agency, pictured here today. But back then it was sorely needed to be, it was kind of called a watchdog. So it would monitor corporations and see what they were up to, and also prosecute, right? Go after them to make sure that they were not creating unfair monopolies or trusts. I'd like to conclude with a question. What is the most important legacy of the Progressive Era? So I've given you 4 pictures, one of child labor, one with the women's suffrage picketing in front of the White House, the slaughterhouse down there below, and to the right, the workers that we talked about in Lawrence, Massachusetts, the Bread and Roses strike. So I want you just to pick one and be prepared to defend it in your group, and then from your groups we will also have a whole class discussion about what we think is the most important contribution or legacy from the Progressive Era. This is Mrs. Tevis-Finn signing off. Ruja is watching. I hope you all do your homework, and I will see you tomorrow.